I stood frozen in this boardroom as my husband Derek publicly humiliated me during a client presentation, dismissing my ideas and cutting me off mid-sentence. The room fell silent as he announced I was just here to learn from the professionals. What nobody knew was that I had been secretly documenting every financial irregularity I had discovered in Derek's company over the past 6 months. Tonight, I would receive the final piece of evidence that would change everything. The shareholders' meeting was in 3 weeks, and I held the company's future in my hands. My name is Chastity, and 5 years ago, I thought I had found my Prince Charming. Derek Morrison swept into my life when I was a 23-year-old junior marketing coordinator at Morrison Tech Solutions, fresh out of college with big dreams and an even bigger student loan debt. He was the golden boy of the company, the charismatic vice president of sales, who could charm clients into million-dollar contracts with nothing more than his infectious smile and silver tongue. Our first encounter happened during a company retreat in the mountains of Colorado. I was presenting my analysis of our target demographics when Derek walked into the conference room late, his designer suit slightly wrinkled from travel. Instead of quietly taking a seat, he interrupted my presentation with what he called constructive feedback. At the time, I thought he was being helpful, offering insights that elevated my work. Looking back, I realize it was my first taste of what would become a suffocating pattern. Derek pursued me with the intensity of a man on a mission. Expensive dinners at restaurants I could never afford, weekend getaways to wine country flowers delivered to my tiny apartment every Friday without fail. He made me feel like the most important person in his world, constantly telling me how brilliant I was, how much potential he saw in me. When he proposed 18 months later on a beach in Malibu with a ring that cost more than my annual salary, I said yes without hesitation. The wedding was everything a girl could dream of. 300 guests at an exclusive vineyard in Napa Valley, a dress that made me feel like royalty, and a honeymoon in Italy that lasted 2 weeks. Derek spared no expense, and I felt like the luckiest woman alive. His family welcomed me with open arms, and his friends treated me like their new little sister. For those first few months of marriage, life felt perfect. The changes started subtly. Derek began offering more frequent corrections during my presentations at work. He would interrupt me during meetings not maliciously, but with the patient tone of a teacher guiding a struggling student. He started suggesting I observe rather than participate in important client calls, explaining that I needed more experience before taking the lead. When I protested, he would kiss my forehead and remind me that he only wanted what was best for my career. Within a year of marriage, my role at Morrison Tech had been quietly diminished. My successful marketing campaigns were now attributed to team efforts under Derek's guidance. The innovative social media strategies I had developed were presented as his ideas with my assistance. When clients complimented our marketing approach, Derek would smile graciously and mention how he was mentoring his wife through the complexities of corporate strategy. The worst part was how he did it all with such apparent affection. In public, Derek was the doting husband who praised his brilliant wife. In private, he would review my work with the exhaustive attention of a professor grading a remedial student. He never raised his voice or showed anger. Instead, he would sigh with disappointment when I failed to meet his expectations, reminding me that he was only trying to help me reach my potential. Our social circle began to shift as well. Derek's friends and colleagues started treating me with the polite distance reserved for someone who was tolerated rather than respected. Conversations would pause when I entered a room, then resume with simpler topics that supposedly better matched my comprehension level. When I tried to contribute to discussions about business strategy or market trends, Derek would gently redirect the conversation, suggesting we discuss something more in my wheelhouse. The isolation was gradual but complete. My college friends grew tired of canceled plans when Derek decided we had more important obligations. My family started questioning whether I was happy, noting how quiet I had become during visits. When I tried to explain that I was simply learning to navigate a more sophisticated social environment, even I could hear how hollow the words sounded. The breaking point came during a client presentation 6 months ago. I had spent weeks developing a comprehensive rebranding strategy for our biggest account, a tech startup looking to pivot their image for a public offering. My research was thorough, my approach innovative, and my presentation polished. As I stood before the conference room full of executives, I felt confident and prepared. Derek arrived 20 minutes into my presentation, apologizing for his delay while taking a seat at the head of the table. Within minutes, he was interjecting with questions that undermined my authority, suggestions that contradicted my recommendations, and gentle corrections that made me appear unprepared. When the client asked about implementation timelines, Derek answered before I could respond, explaining that I was still developing my project management skills. By the end of the meeting, my carefully crafted presentation had been transformed into Derek's vision with my supplementary support. The clients thanked him for his insights while offering me encouraging smiles that felt more like consolation prizes. As everyone filed out of the conference room, Derek squeezed my shoulder and whispered that I had done well for someone still learning the ropes. That night, I sat in our luxurious home office staring at the awards on Derek's wall that included recognition for campaigns I had actually created. The gold-framed certificates and gleaming trophies told the story of his meteoric rise in the company, a rise built partially on work that had been mine. For the first time in 3 years, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been desperately trying to ignore. My husband was systematically erasing my professional identity while convincing everyone, including me, that he was helping me build it. And the most terrifying part was how naturally it had happened, how easy it had been for him to rewrite history while making me grateful for the privilege of being rewritten. But that night, as I organized Derek's desk for an upcoming dinner party with potential investors, I discovered something that changed everything. Hidden beneath a stack of quarterly reports was Derek's personal laptop left open to a spreadsheet that made my blood run cold. Column after column of numbers that didn't match our official financial records transactions to companies I had never heard of, and amounts that were staggering in their size and frequency. Derek had been stealing from his own company, embezzling client funds through a network of fake vendors and shell corporations. The numbers were meticulous, the scheme sophisticated, and the total amount stolen was over $2 million. As I stared at the screen, one thought echoed through my mind with crystal clarity: he was planning to blame this on someone else, and I was the perfect candidate. The next morning, I sat across from Derek at our marble breakfast counter, watching him read the financial news, while sipping his coffee, the picture of a successful executive starting his day. He looked so normal, so trustworthy in his crisp white shirt and navy tie, that I almost convinced myself I had imagined what I saw on his laptop. But the numbers were burned into my memory, along with the sick realization that my husband was not just a manipulative spouse, but a criminal. I knew I couldn't confront Derek directly. 3 years of systematic diminishment had taught me that he was always 10 steps ahead, always prepared with explanations that made me question my own perceptions. If I accused him of embezzlement without ironclad proof, he would find a way to turn it around to make me seem unstable or confused. I needed evidence, and I needed allies. My opportunity came 3 days later at a corporate networking event downtown. Derek had encouraged me to attend, suggesting it would be good for my professional development to meet other women in business. As usual, his suggestion felt more like a gentle directive, but for once I was grateful for his manipulation. The event was exactly where I needed to be. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was filled with successful women from across the city's business community. I felt out of place in my conservative dress and modest jewelry, surrounded by women who radiated the kind of confidence I remembered having before my marriage. I was nursing my second glass of wine and contemplating an early exit when a woman approached me with a warm smile. Janet Walsh was everything I wished I could be. Tall and elegant with silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place in rooms full of powerful people. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her business card identified her as a senior forensic accountant with Morrison Patterson and Associates. We talked for over an hour, and I found myself sharing more than I had intended. Janet had a way of listening that made me feel heard, really heard for the first time in years. When I mentioned my frustrations with feeling undervalued at work, she nodded with understanding that seemed to come from personal experience rather than polite sympathy. As the evening wound down, Janet suggested we continue our conversation over lunch. Something in her tone made me suspect this was more than casual networking. And when we met at a quiet bistro 2 days later, my suspicions were confirmed. Janet ordered a salad and got straight to business. She had been investigating financial irregularities at several tech companies in our area, following a pattern of embezzlement that seemed to target firms with rapid growth and loose oversight. Morrison Tech Solutions had come to her attention after a whistleblower tip suggested something was wrong with our books. My hands started shaking as Janet described the typical profile of corporate embezzlers. Charismatic leaders who built personal loyalty, sophisticated operators who created complex schemes, and master manipulators who always had someone else ready to take the fall. When she asked if I had noticed anything unusual about the company's finances, I felt like she was reading directly from the script of my marriage. I told her about the spreadsheet on Derek's laptop describing the numbers and company names I remembered. Janet's expression grew more serious with each detail, and when I finished, she pulled out her phone and showed me a list of shell corporations that matched several of the names I had seen. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying precision. Over the next few weeks, Janet and I developed a careful strategy for gathering evidence. She taught me how to photograph documents without leaving traces, how to access financial records that Derek thought were secure, and how to build a timeline of transactions that would satisfy federal investigators. Most importantly, she taught me how to protect myself legally while we built our case. The work was exhausting and dangerous. I had to maintain the facade of the devoted wife while secretly documenting my husband's crimes. Every evening I would return home and act interested in Derek's stories about his day, all while knowing that his successes were built on stolen money. I learned to smile and nod when he corrected my opinions, to thank him when he explained things I already understood, to be grateful for his guidance while secretly recording our conversations. The hardest part was discovering how extensive Derek's deception had been. Janet helped me trace the embezzlement back 3 years to right around the time of our wedding. The expensive honeymoon, the luxury car he bought me for my birthday, the down payment on our house, even my engagement ring had all been purchased with money stolen from clients who trusted Morrison Tech with their futures. But the worst discovery came when Janet showed me emails Derek had been sending to the company's board of directors. For months, he had been planting seeds of doubt about my competence and stability. Subtle suggestions that I was struggling with the pressure of working with my husband, implications that I might be making mistakes that could cost the company money, gentle recommendations that my responsibilities be reduced for everyone's protection. Derek wasn't just stealing money, he was preparing to frame me for the theft, and he was doing it with the same patient manipulation that had characterized our entire marriage, slowly building a narrative that would make me the obvious suspect when the embezzlement was inevitably discovered. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Janet had been working with Marcus Thompson, the founder and largest shareholder of Morrison Tech Solutions. Marcus had built the company from nothing 20 years ago, but in recent years he had stepped back from day-to-day operations, allowing Derek to essentially run the business. Janet revealed that Marcus had been growing suspicious of Derek's financial management, but lacked the expertise to investigate his concerns. When Janet arranged for me to meet Marcus at his home office, I was surprised by his warmth and genuine concern. This was a man who had built a successful company by trusting and empowering his employees, and Derek's betrayal wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. Marcus had mentored Derek, promoted him, and trusted him with the future of everything he had worked to build. As I shared my evidence with Marcus, I watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a steely determination that reminded me why he had been successful in business. He wasn't just going to help us expose Derek, he was going to make sure that everyone who had been hurt by his crimes received justice. But Marcus also shared information that made our situation far more urgent. Derek had been pressuring the board to make changes to the company's financial oversight changes that would give him even more control and make his embezzlement harder to detect. More troubling, Derek had been suggesting that I be removed from my position entirely, citing concerns about my emotional stability and potential liability to the company. As I drove home that evening, I realized that Derek's timeline was accelerating. The annual shareholders meeting was less than 2 weeks away, and everything I had learned suggested that he was planning to use that gathering to complete his destruction of my reputation while securing his own position. I had been preparing for a battle, but Derek was preparing for a war, and he had no intention of leaving any witnesses to his crimes. The thought that terrified me most was how confident he seemed. Derek came home that night whistling, kissed me on the forehead, and asked about my day with the casual affection of a man without a care in the world. As he settled into his home office to work on his presentation for the shareholders meeting, I realized that he truly believed he had thought of everything. What Derek had never questioned was my silence. In his mind, I was the same insecure young woman he had married, grateful for his guidance and incapable of challenging his authority. He had no idea that in my silence, I had been preparing, reading, and taking notes. And in less than 2 weeks, he would discover exactly how much his wife had learned. The morning after my meeting with Marcus, I woke up to find Derek already dressed and checking his phone with unusual intensity. His normally perfect composure showed cracks of tension around his eyes, and when I asked if everything was okay, he brushed off my concern with a dismissive wave. Over breakfast, Derek mentioned that the board had called an emergency meeting for later that week to discuss some financial discrepancies that had come to their attention. My blood went cold as he explained with apparent concern that someone in the accounting department had discovered irregularities that might indicate embezzlement or fraud. He shook his head sadly, wondering aloud how something like this could happen at a company built on trust and integrity. As Derek spoke about the upcoming investigation, I realized with growing horror that his plan was already in motion. He wasn't just preparing to blame me for his crimes, he was actively creating the narrative that would destroy my life. Every concerned expression, every worried comment about the company's reputation was calculated to establish his own innocence while building a case against someone else. That afternoon, Janet called with urgent news. Her contacts at the SEC had confirmed that Morrison Tech Solutions was under preliminary investigation following an anonymous tip about financial irregularities. What made the situation dangerous was that Derek appeared to be cooperating fully with investigators, positioning himself as a concerned executive, trying to protect his company from internal threats. The anonymous tip had specifically mentioned concerns about employees with access to client accounts who might be using their positions to steal funds. According to Janet's sources, the investigation was focusing on recent changes in account management and any staff members who might be under personal or financial stress. The profile they were building sounded disturbingly familiar. I met with Marcus and Janet that evening at a coffee shop across town, far from anywhere Derek might see us together. Marcus looked older than he had just days before, the weight of discovering his protégé's betrayal evident in every line of his face. But his voice was steady as he shared what he had learned from his own investigation. Derek had been more careful than we initially realized. The embezzlement scheme involved creating fake invoices from legitimate-sounding vendors, then having payments deposited into accounts he controlled. The vendors existed on paper, but were actually shell companies Derek had established using borrowed identities and false addresses. The sophistication of the operation suggested he had been planning this for years, not months. More troubling, Derek had convinced 2 board members that the financial irregularities were likely the result of employee theft rather than systematic fraud. He had presented them with evidence suggesting that someone with access to client accounts had been skimming funds and covering their tracks by manipulating internal records. The evidence pointed to someone in marketing who had recently gained expanded access to financial systems as part of their role in account management. I felt sick as I realized how perfectly Derek had set me up. 6 months ago, he had suggested that I take on additional responsibilities in client relations, explaining that it would be good for my professional development. I had been grateful for the opportunity to expand my role and prove my value to the company. Now I understood that Derek had been giving me access to the very systems he was using to steal money, ensuring that my digital fingerprints would be all over his crime scene. Janet pulled out a folder containing copies of emails Derek had sent to various board members over the past few months. Each message was a masterpiece of subtle manipulation expressing concern about my behavior and performance while maintaining the tone of a caring husband, trying to protect his struggling wife. In one email, Derek worried about my increased stress levels and how they might be affecting my judgment. In another, he mentioned that I had been working late frequently and seemed secretive about my projects. A third email suggested that my access to sensitive financial information might be creating pressure I wasn't equipped to handle. Reading these emails felt like watching Derek dissect my character with surgical precision. Every private conversation we had shared, every moment of vulnerability I had shown him, had been twisted into evidence of my potential guilt. He had used our marriage as a weapon-gathering ammunition for a battle I hadn't even known we were fighting. Marcus revealed that Derek had already suggested to the board that they quietly limit my access to financial systems while the investigation proceeded. He had framed it as protecting both me and the company, explaining that reducing my responsibilities would prevent any appearance of impropriety while shielding me from additional stress during a difficult time. The recommendation had been presented with such apparent compassion that the board had agreed immediately. Starting Monday, my computer access would be restricted, my role in client relations suspended, and my involvement in financial planning eliminated. Derek had effectively fired me while making it look like protection, and he had done it with the full support of people who thought they were helping me. But Marcus had refused to sign off on the changes, using his position as founder and largest shareholder to delay implementation until after the shareholders' meeting. He explained to the board that any major personnel decisions should be made with full shareholder input, especially when they involved family members of senior executives. It was a temporary reprieve, but it gave us time to build our case. Janet had been working with her contacts to trace Derek's financial network, and what she discovered was even more extensive than we had feared. The embezzlement at Morrison Tech was just the latest in a series of similar schemes Derek had orchestrated at previous companies. She had found evidence linking him to financial irregularities at 3 other firms where he had worked over the past decade. The pattern was always the same. Derek would join a growing company, quickly establish himself as indispensable, then begin systematically stealing while building a case against a convenient scapegoat. In each previous case, he had left just before the theft was discovered, moving on to a new opportunity while his former colleagues were left to deal with the aftermath. What made Morrison Tech different was that Derek had gotten married and couldn't simply disappear when the scheme was discovered. Instead, he had decided to frame me and use the resulting scandal to eliminate any potential witnesses while positioning himself as the victim of his wife's betrayal. As Janet laid out the timeline, I realized how long Derek had been planning this. Our marriage, my job at Morrison Tech, even my expanded role in account management had all been part of his strategy. I hadn't been his wife. I had been his exit strategy, carefully positioned to take the fall for crimes that would destroy my life while enhancing his reputation as a wronged husband and dedicated executive. The meeting ended with a plan that made my stomach churn with anxiety. We would continue gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance that nothing had changed. Marcus would keep delaying any personnel decisions while secretly preparing for the shareholders' meeting. Janet would coordinate with federal investigators to ensure they had access to our evidence when the time came to act. And I would continue being Derek's perfect wife, supportive and trusting, while secretly recording every conversation and documenting every lie. The hardest part would be maintaining the facade when I now knew exactly what Derek was planning to do to me. As I drove home that night, I thought about the shareholders' meeting that was now less than 10 days away. Derek was confident that he had thought of everything that his careful planning would protect him while destroying me. He had underestimated only one thing: his wife's ability to learn, adapt, and fight back. Derek was waiting for me when I got home, concerned about my late evening and eager to know where I had been. I smiled and explained that I had been shopping with a friend, showing him a bag from a store I had picked up to support my story. He seemed satisfied with my explanation, kissing my forehead and reminding me that I shouldn't stay out too late when I was already under so much stress. As Derek headed to his office to work on his presentation for the shareholders' meeting, I realized that his greatest weakness was also his greatest strength. His ability to manipulate and control had made him successful, but it had also made him arrogant. He was so confident in his superiority that he couldn't imagine being outmaneuvered by anyone, especially not by the wife he had spent 3 years teaching to doubt herself. In 10 days, Derek would discover that his student had learned more than he intended to teach, and the lesson I was about to give him would be one he would never forget. The week before the shareholders' meeting passed in a surreal blur of normalcy, masking absolute chaos. Derek maintained his routine with clockwork precision, leaving for work each morning with a kiss and returning each evening with stories about his day that I now knew were carefully crafted lies. But I could see the tension building beneath his polished exterior, small cracks in the facade that revealed the pressure he was under. Janet called me Tuesday morning with news that made my hands shake. Her investigation had uncovered something even more sinister than we had initially suspected. Derek's embezzlement scheme wasn't just about stealing money, it was about preparing for a complete disappearance. She had discovered that he had been establishing a new identity in the Cayman Islands, complete with bank accounts, property ownership, and even a girlfriend who had no idea she was dating a criminal. The girlfriend was Angela Price, Morrison Tech's head of human resources, a stunning brunette with an MBA from Stanford and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Janet's research revealed that Derek and Angela had been secretly involved for over a year, meeting at luxury hotels and taking weekend trips to locations they described as business conferences. What made Angela's involvement particularly dangerous was her position within the company. As head of HR, she had access to personnel files, performance reviews, and employment records for every Morrison Tech employee. Janet had discovered that Angela had been systematically altering my employment history, creating a false narrative of declining performance and increasing instability that would support Derek's claims about my mental state. My original performance reviews had been excellent, filled with praise for my creativity, analytical skills, and client relationship management. But the versions now in my official file told a different story. Angela had inserted concerns about my emotional volatility, questions about my attention to detail, and recommendations for closer supervision that painted me as an employee struggling to meet basic requirements. The alterations were subtle but devastating. A positive review about my innovative marketing campaign had been modified to suggest that the campaign succeeded despite my poor planning and execution. Praise for my client relationships had been changed to express concern about my tendency to overshare personal information during professional meetings. Even my punctuality and attendance records had been altered to suggest chronic tardiness and unexplained absences. Janet showed me copies of the original documents alongside Angela's modifications, and the comparison made me sick. Every professional achievement I had earned was being systematically erased, replaced with a false history that would make Derek's accusations seem credible. Angela hadn't just been helping Derek steal money, she had been helping him steal my life. Marcus confirmed that Angela had been working closely with Derek to prepare for the shareholders meeting, providing HR documentation that would support his recommendations for my removal from the company. She had prepared a psychological profile suggesting that I was experiencing a mental health crisis that made me dangerous to both myself and the organization. The profile was a masterpiece of clinical manipulation using legitimate psychological terminology to create a picture of someone suffering from severe stress-induced paranoia and potential bipolar disorder. Angela had apparently consulted with a psychiatrist who specialized in workplace mental health issues, though Janet suspected the consultation had been paid for by Derek and involved selectively presented information designed to support a predetermined conclusion. But Marcus also shared some encouraging news. His position as founder and largest shareholder gave him significant influence over the shareholders' meeting agenda, and he had been using that power to ensure our plan could succeed. The meeting would follow a specific format that would allow for presentations from both Derek and myself, though Derek didn't know about my planned participation. Marcus had also been conducting his own investigation into the company's board of directors, trying to determine which members might be compromised by Derek's influence. What he discovered was troubling but not surprising. Derek had been cultivating relationships with individual board members for months, providing them with investment opportunities and business connections that created personal loyalties extending far beyond their corporate responsibilities. 2 board members in particular seemed to be completely under Derek's control. James Patterson, the chairman of Morrison Tech's audit committee, had received several lucrative consulting contracts through connections Derek had provided. Susan Martinez, the head of the compensation committee, had been given insider information about potential mergers that had allowed her to make profitable stock trades in other companies. Neither Patterson nor Martinez had broken any laws, but their financial relationships with Derek created obvious conflicts of interest that would make them powerful allies in his campaign against me. Marcus was confident they would support whatever narrative Derek presented, regardless of the evidence we might offer in contradiction. Janet had been coordinating with her contacts at the FBI and SEC to ensure that federal investigators would be present at the shareholders' meeting. The plan was to let Derek present his accusations against me, allowing him to commit perjury and obstruction of justice in front of witnesses before revealing the evidence of his own crimes. The strategy was risky because it required me to endure public humiliation before fighting back, but Janet explained that we needed Derek to fully commit to his false narrative before exposing the truth. If we revealed our evidence too early, he might be able to claim he was also a victim of deception rather than the mastermind of a complex conspiracy. Wednesday evening, Derek came home with flowers and a bottle of champagne, explaining that he wanted to celebrate our relationship before the stress of the shareholders' meeting made things difficult. As we sat on our terrace overlooking the city, he talked about his vision for our future with the kind of romantic idealism that had originally swept me off my feet. Derek spoke about traveling together once the investigation was resolved, maybe taking a sabbatical to explore Europe or Asia while the company recovered from its recent challenges. He mentioned properties he had been researching in tropical locations where we could escape the pressures of corporate life and focus on each other. Listening to Derek paint this picture of our future, knowing that his actual plan involved framing me for his crimes while disappearing with Angela felt like being slowly poisoned by someone offering me medicine. Every word of love and commitment was a lie designed to keep me compliant until he was ready to destroy me. But I played my part perfectly, smiling and nodding, while Derek described our imaginary future. I told him how much I appreciated his support during this difficult time, how grateful I was to have a husband who believed in me when others questioned my abilities. I even managed to cry a little when I talked about how scared I was of losing my job and disappointing everyone who had trusted me. Derek held me while I cried, stroking my hair and whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. He promised that no matter what happened at the shareholders' meeting, he would stand by me and help me rebuild my career. His performance was so convincing that for a moment I almost believed him myself, remembering why I had fallen in love with this man before discovering what he really was. Thursday brought a development that nearly derailed our entire plan. Derek announced that he had arranged for me to take a vacation day on Friday, the day of the shareholders' meeting. He explained that Angela had recommended I avoid the stress of attending, since the meeting would likely focus on personnel issues that might be triggering for someone in my situation. Derek had spoken with my doctor about prescribing something to help me relax during this difficult time, and he suggested I spend Friday at a spa he had researched that specialized in stress relief and mental health support. He had already made the appointment and paid for a full day of treatments designed to help me cope with workplace anxiety. The suggestion was presented with such apparent care that refusing would have seemed irrational and suspicious. Derek was giving me an alibi that would keep me away from the shareholders' meeting while making it appear that I was too unstable to participate in my own defense. If I didn't attend the meeting, everything Derek said about me would go unchallenged, and I would have no opportunity to present my evidence. I told Derek I thought the spa day was a wonderful idea, but suggested we wait until after the shareholders' meeting so I could focus completely on relaxation without worrying about work. He insisted that attending the meeting would be too stressful for me, and that taking care of my mental health should be our top priority. Our conversation became a delicate dance of manipulation with Derek trying to convince me to absent myself from the meeting while I tried to insist on attending without revealing my true motivations. Finally, I suggested a compromise that seemed to satisfy him. I would attend the meeting but would sit in the back of the room as an observer, avoiding any participation that might add to my stress. Derek agreed to this arrangement, though he made me promise to leave immediately if I started feeling overwhelmed. He also suggested that Angela would be available to escort me out if necessary, since she had experience helping employees deal with workplace mental health crises. As we finalized the details of my attendance at the shareholders' meeting, I realized that Derek's plan was even more sophisticated than I had initially understood. He wasn't just going to accuse me of embezzlement, he was going to do it in a way that made my absence or breakdown seem inevitable. Every element of his strategy was designed to make his victory appear both justified and compassionate. Friday morning, the day of the shareholders' meeting, Derek woke up earlier than usual and spent extra time getting ready. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with geometric precision, and his confidence radiated from every gesture. As he kissed me goodbye, he reminded me to stay calm during the meeting and to remember that everything he was going to do was for our future together. Watching Derek leave for what he believed would be his moment of triumph, I felt a mixture of terror and determination that made my heart race. In just a few hours, one of our lives would be completely destroyed. Derek was absolutely certain it would be mine. He had no idea that his wife had been preparing for this battle longer and more carefully than he could possibly imagine. And in just a few hours, he would learn exactly what his student had been studying while he thought she was learning to be quiet and obedient. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem sharper and more vivid than usual. I woke at 5:30, unable to sleep, and spent an hour going through my final preparations, while Derek slept peacefully beside me, his face relaxed with the confidence of someone who believed he had thought of everything. By 7 o'clock, Derek was in the shower, humming quietly while he prepared for what he believed would be his greatest professional triumph. I made coffee and toast, playing the role of the supportive wife one last time, while my stomach churned with a mixture of terror and anticipation that made eating impossible. Derek came downstairs looking like he was heading to a photo shoot for a business magazine. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored. His white shirt crisp enough to cut paper, and his silk tie was knotted with the precision of someone who understood that image was everything in corporate warfare. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent weeks planning every detail of the day ahead. Over breakfast, Derek reviewed his strategy with the casual tone of someone discussing weekend plans. He would begin by presenting an overview of the company's financial challenges, focusing on recent irregularities that had raised concerns about internal theft. Then he would provide evidence suggesting that someone with access to client accounts had been systematically stealing funds while covering their tracks through manipulation of internal records. Derek explained that he would be careful not to make direct accusations, instead presenting facts and allowing the shareholders to draw their own conclusions about who might be responsible. He had prepared documentation showing suspicious activity in accounts I had managed unexplained transfers that coincided with my expanded responsibilities and behavioral patterns that suggested someone under extreme stress was making increasingly reckless decisions. The beauty of his approach, Derek noted with obvious pride, was that he would appear to be protecting me even while destroying me. He would express concern about my mental health worry about the pressure I had been under and suggest that the company needed to handle the situation with compassion rather than pursuing criminal charges immediately. As Derek outlined his plan, I realized he genuinely believed he was being generous by offering me the chance to resign quietly rather than face public prosecution. In his mind, he was giving me an opportunity to preserve some dignity while accepting responsibility for crimes he had committed. The arrogance was breathtaking, but Derek had made one critical error in his planning and oversight that would prove to be his downfall. He had become so focused on controlling the narrative about my guilt that he had never considered the possibility that someone might be investigating his innocence. His confidence in his own superiority had blinded him to threats he couldn't imagine. Janet called at 8:15 while Derek was in his office putting the finishing touches on his presentation. Her voice was tight with urgency as she confirmed that federal investigators would be present at the meeting positioned as security consultants reviewing corporate governance procedures. Derek would present his evidence to people who already knew he was lying, and every word he spoke would be documented as part of a federal criminal case. Marcus had also finalized the arrangement that would allow me to present my own evidence after Derek finished his accusations. The meeting agenda included time for shareholder comments and concerns, which would give me an opportunity to address the board directly. Derek knew about this portion of the meeting but assumed I would be too devastated by his revelations to participate. At 9 o'clock, Derek called Angela to confirm the final details of their coordination. I could hear her voice through his phone, bright and professional, as she assured him that everything was ready. She had prepared the psychological profile that would support his recommendations, coordinated with the board members who would endorse his proposals, and arranged for security to escort me from the building if I became disruptive. Derek ended the call with a casual affection that made my skin crawl, telling Angela he would see her soon and thanking her for all her support during this difficult situation. The ease with which he shifted between manipulating me and conspiring with his lover was a master class in compartmentalized deception. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled to begin at 10:30 at Morrison Tech's headquarters, in the same conference room where Derek had humiliated me 6 months ago. As Derek gathered his materials and prepared to leave, he turned to me with an expression of such apparent concern that I almost believed he actually cared about my well-being. Derek reminded me to stay calm during the meeting, to remember that whatever happened was not my fault, and to trust that he would take care of everything. He suggested that I might want to leave as soon as his presentation was finished, since the discussion that followed could be difficult to hear. He had even arranged for a car to take me home if I needed to make a quick exit. Every word was calculated to make me compliant and passive, to ensure that I would accept his destruction of my life with gratitude for his apparent compassion. Derek kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and promised that everything would work out for the best. Then he left for the office, confident that when he returned home that evening, I would be completely broken and entirely dependent on his mercy. I waited 10 minutes after Derek left, then called Janet to confirm our final timing. Marcus would introduce Derek's presentation at exactly 11 o'clock, giving Derek 30 minutes to present his evidence and answer questions from the board. At 11:30, Marcus would open the floor for shareholder comments, and that would be my moment to fight back. The drive to Morrison Tech felt like traveling to my own execution. I had spent the past week preparing for this confrontation, but nothing could have prepared me for the actual feeling of walking into a building where half the people believed I was a criminal and the other half were about to watch me be destroyed by my own husband. I arrived at the office 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, taking a seat in the back of the conference room where Derek had suggested I would be most comfortable. The room was already filling with shareholders, board members, and senior staff, all of whom greeted me with the polite sympathy reserved for someone facing public disgrace. Derek was at the front of the room reviewing his notes with the focused intensity of a performer preparing for opening night. He looked up when I entered, offering me a reassuring smile and a small wave that acknowledged my presence while maintaining his professional demeanor. Even now, he was managing appearances with calculated precision. Angela sat near the front of the room, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and predatory smile. She was wearing a navy blue suit that projected authority and competence, the perfect uniform for someone about to help destroy a colleague's life. When our eyes met, she offered me a compassionate nod that made me want to scream. As the clock approached 10:30, Marcus called the meeting to order with the formal tone that corporate governance required. He reviewed the agenda, noted the presence of various consultants and advisors, and explained that today's gathering would address some important financial and personnel matters that required shareholder input. Derek's presentation was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock, giving him 30 minutes to present what Marcus described as concerning developments in the company's financial oversight. Marcus's voice betrayed nothing as he outlined the agenda, but I caught his eyes for a moment and saw the steel determination that had built Morrison Tech from nothing. At exactly 11 o'clock, Marcus introduced Derek with the kind of professional courtesy that gave no hint of the betrayal he now understood. Derek stood with the easy confidence of someone who had given hundreds of successful presentations, his smile warm and engaging as he thanked everyone for their attention during what he knew would be a difficult discussion. And then Derek began to destroy my life with the smooth professionalism that had made him successful in business. Every word was calculated, every pause timed for maximum impact, every gesture designed to convey reluctant honesty from someone forced to reveal painful truths. For the next 25 minutes, I sat in the back of the room and listened to my husband systematically dismantle my reputation, my career, and my future. He presented evidence that painted me as mentally unstable, financially desperate, and criminally inclined. He described a pattern of behavior that suggested I had been stealing from clients for months while using my position as his wife to avoid scrutiny. Derek's performance was flawless. He appeared reluctant to share information that reflected poorly on his wife, concerned about my mental health, and committed to finding a solution that would protect both the company and my dignity. He never directly accused me of specific crimes, but his implications were unmistakable. As Derek concluded his presentation and opened the floor for questions, I realized that this was the moment when my old life officially ended. Everyone in that room now believed I was a criminal who had betrayed their trust and stolen their money. The woman I had been when I walked into the meeting no longer existed, but Derek had made one fatal error in his calculations. He had destroyed Chastity, the victim, the woman who had spent 3 years learning to doubt herself and accept his guidance. What he had never anticipated was that in teaching me to be quiet and observant, he had also taught me to be patient and strategic. At 11:35, Marcus called for shareholder comments and concerns. The room was silent for a moment, everyone processing what they had just heard and uncertain how to respond to such devastating revelations. Then Marcus announced that there was one more presentation on the agenda from someone who had requested time to address the shareholders about today's financial disclosures. The entire room turned to look at me as I stood up in the back, my hands steady and my voice clear as I said the words that would change everything. "Thank you, Marcus. I have some information that I believe the shareholders need to hear." The silence that followed my words was absolute. Derek's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances, cycling from confusion to concern to the first flicker of genuine fear I had ever seen him display. Angela's professional composure cracked just enough to reveal the predator beneath her eyes narrowing as she tried to calculate how much damage I might be capable of inflicting. Marcus nodded formally and gestured for me to come forward, his voice steady as he explained to the room that I had requested time to respond to the financial concerns that had been raised. Several board members exchanged glances that suggested they found this development inappropriate, but Marcus's authority as founder and largest shareholder carried the moment. Derek stood up quickly, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned protectiveness, as he suggested that I might want to wait until I had legal representation before making any public statements. He reminded the room that I was under considerable stress and might not be thinking clearly about the potential consequences of speaking without proper guidance. Angela reinforced Derek's concerns with clinical precision, noting that the psychological profile she had prepared specifically recommended against putting me in high-stress situations where I might make statements I would later regret. She suggested that the compassionate thing would be to adjourn the meeting and allow me time to process the allegations with appropriate professional support. But Marcus calmly explained that corporate governance required giving all shareholders an opportunity to address matters affecting the company, and that my status as both an employee and a shareholder entitled me to speak. He asked Derek and Angela to take their seats while I presented my information to the board. As I walked to the front of the room, I could feel the weight of every gaze focused on me, with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and anticipation. These people had just watched Derek present compelling evidence that I was a mentally unstable embezzler, and now they were about to hear what my damaged mind had to say in response. I had prepared for this moment for weeks, but standing before a room full of people who believed I was a criminal still made my heart race with adrenaline that was part terror and part exhilaration. This was my one chance to fight back, and I was going to make it count. Derek settled back in his chair with the patient expression of someone preparing to watch a loved one embarrass herself publicly. His posture radiated confidence and control, the demeanor of a man who had planned for every contingency and was certain of his victory. Angela sat beside him, her notebook ready to document anything I said that might support their narrative about my mental instability. I began by thanking everyone for their patience and acknowledging that I understood how difficult this situation must be for all of them. My voice was calm and measured, showing none of the emotional volatility that Derek and Angela had spent months documenting in their false reports. Then I explained that over the past 6 months, I had become increasingly concerned about financial irregularities I had noticed in my work with client accounts. As someone with access to account management systems, I had observed patterns of transactions that seemed inconsistent with our normal business practices. The room was completely silent as I described discovering shell companies that existed only on paper invoice payments to vendors that had no verifiable business operations and accounting entries that didn't match the supporting documentation. I explained that these concerns had led me to document everything I found working with forensic accounting specialists to understand the scope of what appeared to be systematic embezzlement. Derek's confidence was beginning to show cracks around the edges. His relaxed posture had become more rigid, and his patient smile had developed a frozen quality that suggested he was working to maintain control. Angela was taking notes frantically, trying to document anything I said that could be used to support claims about my paranoia or delusional thinking. But I had been careful to present facts rather than accusations, numbers rather than theories. Everything I said could be verified through corporate records, and my tone was that of someone reporting objective findings rather than making emotional claims. I continued by explaining that my investigation had revealed a sophisticated scheme involving the creation of fake vendors, the establishment of shell companies in multiple states, and the systematic theft of client funds over a period of several years. The scheme was complex enough to require significant financial expertise and administrative access that would allow the perpetrator to manipulate records and cover their tracks. As I spoke, I could see several board members beginning to pay closer attention, their expressions shifting from polite sympathy to genuine interest. James Patterson and Susan Martinez, the 2 board members Derek had cultivated, were both staring at their notes and avoiding eye contact. But other members were leaning forward with the focused attention of people hearing something important. I explained that the embezzlement scheme had involved stealing approximately $2.4 million over 3 years' money that had been diverted from client accounts through a network of fake invoices and fraudulent vendors. The stolen funds had been deposited in offshore accounts and used to purchase assets that could be easily liquidated or transferred. Derek's facade finally cracked completely. He stood up abruptly, his voice sharp with an authority he no longer had the right to claim, as he demanded to know where I had gotten this information and who had given me access to confidential financial records. The man who had spent months presenting himself as my protective advocate was suddenly treating me like a hostile witness. Angela tried to support Derek's challenge by questioning my mental state and suggesting that stress had led me to misinterpret normal business transactions as evidence of conspiracy. But her interruption felt desperate rather than professional, and several board members were now studying her with the same attention they had turned toward me. Marcus intervened with the calm authority that had made him successful in business, reminding Derek that I had the floor and requesting that all questions be held until after I finished my presentation. The rebuke was gentle but firm, and Derek had no choice but to sit down while I continued. I moved into the most dangerous part of my presentation, the moment when I would have to make direct accusations rather than simply presenting suspicious patterns. But I had learned from Derek's own strategy, and I would let the evidence speak for itself rather than appearing to attack anyone personally. I explained that the sophistication of the embezzlement scheme suggested it was orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of Morrison Tech's financial systems, someone with access to client information, and the authority to approve unusual transactions. The perpetrator would have needed administrative privileges, detailed understanding of accounting procedures, and the ability to manipulate personnel records to avoid detection. Furthermore, the scheme required coordination with someone in human resources who could alter employment records, modify performance reviews, and create documentation that would support false narratives about employee behavior. The complexity of the operation suggested at least two people working together, one with financial expertise and another with administrative control. As I presented this analysis, Derek and Angela both looked increasingly uncomfortable. Derek was no longer maintaining his patient smile, and Angela had stopped taking notes entirely. Several board members were now looking back and forth between my presentation and the two people I was obviously describing, but I saved the most devastating evidence for last. I explained that my investigation had been conducted in cooperation with forensic accountants and federal investigators who had been examining Morrison Tech's financial records for several months. The evidence I was presenting had already been reviewed by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Derek jumped to his feet again, this time abandoning any pretense of concern for my welfare, as he demanded to know what authority I had to involve federal investigators in company business. Angela was frantically shuffling through papers, apparently trying to find some document that would support their earlier claims about my mental instability. But Marcus was already signaling to someone at the back of the room, and I realized that our carefully planned moment had finally arrived. The security consultants who had been quietly observing the meeting stepped forward, and Marcus announced that they were actually federal agents who had been investigating financial irregularities at Morrison Tech Solutions. Derek's face went completely white as he realized that his perfect plan had become his perfect trap. For months, he had been building a case against me while federal investigators were building a case against him. Every lie he had told, every document he had falsified, every manipulation he had orchestrated had been observed and documented by people who understood exactly what he was doing. Angela made a desperate attempt to maintain their narrative, insisting that I was having a psychotic episode and that nothing I said could be trusted. But her voice carried a note of panic that undermined her professional authority, and the federal agents were already moving toward the front of the room with the purposeful efficiency of people executing a well-planned operation. As Derek realized that his world was collapsing around him, he turned to me with an expression of pure hatred that revealed the man he had always been beneath his charming facade. For the first time in our marriage, he was looking at me as an equal, someone who had outmaneuvered him in a battle he hadn't even realized we were fighting. The room erupted into chaos as board members demanded explanations, shareholders asked questions, and federal agents began taking control of the situation. But through all the confusion, I maintained my position at the front of the room, no longer the quiet wife who accepted guidance and correction. Derek had spent 3 years teaching me to be observant and patient, never imagining that his student would eventually turn those lessons against him. As federal agents read him his rights and placed him under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, I realized that his greatest mistake had been underestimating the woman he had married. The battle was over, but the war for my life had just been won. The arrest happened with the swift efficiency of people who had been planning this moment for weeks. Derek's hands were cuffed behind his back as agents read him his rights, his expensive suit no longer a symbol of success, but a costume that could no longer hide what he really was. Angela tried to maintain her composure, as she was also taken into custody, but her mask of professional competence had completely shattered, revealing the desperation of someone who knew her carefully constructed life was ending. As Derek was led toward the exit, he turned back to look at me one last time. The hatred in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked almost like respect, the grudging acknowledgement of someone who had been beaten at his own game by an opponent he had never taken seriously. For 3 years, he had seen me as a tool to be used and discarded. In this moment, he finally understood that he had been living with an adversary who was smarter, more patient, and ultimately more ruthless than he could have imagined. The conference room remained in stunned silence for several minutes after the arrests. Board members sat frozen in their chairs, processing the revelation that their vice president of sales had been systematically stealing from the company while planning to frame his wife for his crimes. The shareholders looked shell-shocked, trying to comprehend how close they had come to destroying an innocent woman while protecting a master manipulator. Marcus stood to address the room, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had built a company on trust and integrity, only to discover how thoroughly that trust had been betrayed. He explained that Morrison Tech Solutions would cooperate fully with federal investigators, implement new financial oversight procedures, and work to recover the stolen funds for the clients who had been victimized. But Marcus also did something that surprised everyone in the room, including me. He announced that effective immediately, I would be promoted to Chief Operations Officer with full authority to oversee the company's financial recovery and implementation of new security measures. The promotion was both a vindication of my abilities and a public declaration that Morrison Tech stood behind me completely. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Derek's criminal enterprise. Federal agents had been monitoring his activities for months, following a complex trail of financial fraud that extended far beyond Morrison Tech Solutions. Derek had been operating similar schemes at 3 other companies over the past decade, stealing millions of dollars while leaving a trail of destroyed careers and bankrupted businesses in his wake. Angela's role in the conspiracy was equally extensive. She had been systematically falsifying employment records, manipulating performance reviews, and creating false psychological profiles to support Derek's schemes. Her access to human resources systems had allowed them to frame multiple employees for crimes they hadn't committed, destroying lives with the same casual efficiency that Derek had applied to stealing money. The trial lasted 4 months and became a landmark case in corporate fraud prosecution. Derek's defense team tried to argue that he was the victim of a vindictive wife who had manipulated evidence to frame him. But the mountain of documentation Janet and I had gathered made their claims impossible to sustain. Every financial transaction, every falsified document, every manipulated record had been preserved and analyzed by federal forensic accountants. Derek was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The judge noted during sentencing that Derek's crimes had been particularly heinous because they involved the systematic destruction of innocent people's lives to cover his tracks. Angela received 8 years for her role in the conspiracy, along with the permanent loss of her professional credentials. The recovery of the stolen funds took nearly a year, but federal investigators were ultimately able to trace and recover almost 90% of the money Derek had stolen. Morrison Tech's clients were made whole, and the company's reputation was eventually restored through a combination of transparent communication and demonstrably improved oversight procedures. For me, the months following Derek's arrest were a period of profound personal reconstruction. 3 years of systematic psychological abuse had left scars that didn't disappear overnight, and I worked with therapists who specialized in helping victims of narcissistic manipulation rebuild their sense of self-worth and professional confidence. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward, since Derek's criminal conviction eliminated any possibility of his claiming marital assets purchased with stolen money. I received a substantial settlement from the seizure and sale of assets Derek had accumulated through his crimes money that I used to establish a foundation helping women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their careers. Marcus became more than just my boss. He became the mentor. I had never had someone who recognized my abilities and encouraged me to trust my own judgment. Under his guidance, I developed the confidence to lead major initiatives, make difficult decisions, and build the kind of professional reputation that Derek had spent years trying to destroy. Morrison Tech Solutions thrived under new leadership that prioritized transparency, ethical behavior, and genuine respect for all employees. The company implemented training programs on workplace harassment and financial oversight that became models for other organizations. We grew from a regional firm to a national leader in our industry, powered by a culture that valued integrity over image. 2 years after Derek's arrest, I met someone who showed me what healthy love actually looked like. David Chen was a federal prosecutor who had worked on Derek's case, and our relationship developed slowly from professional respect to personal friendship to genuine romance. David understood the scars Derek had left and never tried to rush my healing process or make me feel guilty about the time I needed to learn to trust again. Our wedding was everything my first marriage had pretended to be: genuine, joyful, and built on mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. David and I built a partnership based on equality communication and shared values that made every day better than the one before. We bought a house together, adopted 2 rescue dogs, and created the kind of life I had once believed was impossible. The foundation I established with Derek's seized assets became my greatest professional achievement outside of Morrison Tech. We provided financial assistance, legal support, and career counseling to women trying to escape abusive relationships and rebuild their professional lives. Every woman we helped represented a victory over the kind of systematic manipulation that Derek had perfected. 5 years after that shareholders meeting, I stood before a conference room full of successful women at our foundation's annual gala, sharing my story with people who understood the journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The audience included women who had escaped their own Derek Morrison's professionals, who had rebuilt careers that abusive partners had tried to destroy, and supporters who believed that every woman deserved the chance to discover her own strength. As I concluded my speech that night, I shared the life lesson that had emerged from the worst and best years of my life. I learned that silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. Every moment someone underestimates you is an opportunity to gather strength, knowledge, and evidence. The greatest power comes not from fighting back with anger, but from fighting back with truth, preparation, and unshakable integrity. Derek Morrison spent 3 years teaching me to doubt myself, to accept his guidance, to be grateful for his correction. He never realized that in teaching me to be quiet and observant, he was also teaching me to be patient and strategic. His greatest mistake was believing that his student would never become his teacher. To every woman listening tonight who feels trapped, diminished, or convinced that she's not strong enough to fight back, you are stronger than you know, smarter than they tell you, and more capable than they want you to believe. Your silence can become your strategy, your patience can become your power, and your quiet preparation can become their loudest defeat. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for my speech. It was for every woman who had found the courage to fight back, every survivor who had refused to let abuse define her future, and every person who believed that truth and justice could triumph over manipulation and cruelty. As I looked out at the audience that night, I saw faces that reflected my own journey. Women who had been broken and rebuilt themselves, stronger professionals who had been dismissed and proved their worth, survivors who had transformed their pain into purpose. We were living proof that no manipulator is clever enough to defeat a victim who refuses to stay silent forever. Derek Morrison had taught me many lessons during our marriage, but the most important one came after he was gone. The same qualities that make someone vulnerable to abuse can also make them formidable opponents once they decide to fight back. Empathy becomes strategic thinking, patience becomes careful planning, and the ability to endure suffering becomes the strength to ensure that suffering serves a purpose. My story could have ended with Derek's victory with me destroyed and discredited while he escaped to begin his next scheme. Instead, it became a testament to the power of preparation, the importance of allies, and the ultimate triumph of truth over manipulation. I had learned that the best revenge against someone who underestimates you is not anger or hatred, but the patient accumulation of evidence, the careful building of alliances, and the strategic use of their own arrogance against them. Derek had created his own defeat by teaching his victim to be everything he needed her not to be. As I drove home that night to David and our dogs, and our life built on honesty rather than control, I realized that Derek Morrison had given me the greatest gift possible, though he never intended it. He had shown me exactly what love was not, which made it possible for me to recognize what love actually was when it finally appeared. The woman who had stood in that boardroom 5 years ago, accepting humiliation and believing she deserved it, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had learned that silence could be a choice rather than a surrender, that patience could be a weapon rather than a weakness, and that the quiet accumulation of truth was more powerful than the loudest lie. Derek Morrison had tried to make me disappear. Instead, he had taught me exactly how to make sure that would never happen to anyone else. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone underestimated your strength or intelligence? How did you prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments below. Like this video, if it resonated with your own experiences of overcoming manipulation or workplace abuse, subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that their silence can become their strategy. Thank you for joining me on this journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Remember, you are stronger than they tell you, smarter than they believe, and more powerful than they want you to know. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth.